The bright lights of the studio beamed down as the audience cheered, eagerly awaiting the next guest. Marcus Grant, a self-made black entrepreneur whose company had revolutionized the tech industry, stepped onto the stage with confidence. Dressed in a sleek, tailored suit, he exuded the charisma of a man who had built his success from the ground up. The applause echoed through the room, but the host, Richard Lawson, barely clapped. Instead, he offered a forced smile as he extended his hand. "Marcus Grant," Richard said, his tone laced with an almost imperceptible smirk. "The man who went from nothing to billionaire status? Quite the Cinderella story, wouldn't you say?" Marcus caught the condescension in his voice, but remained composed. He had dealt with skeptics before. This was nothing new. "I wouldn't call it that," Marcus replied smoothly. "I'd say it was years of sacrifice, vision, and relentless effort." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. Of course," he said. "But let's be honest, these days, corporations are looking to highlight diversity. Do you think that played a role in your company's success?" The room fell silent. The tension was palpable. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, sensing that this wasn't going to be the typical success story interview. Marcus smiled, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. "Are you asking if I was handed my success because of my race?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Richard let out a chuckle, clearly unprepared for the directness of the response. "Oh no, not at all. I'm just saying, in today's climate, certain opportunities might be more accessible." Marcus nodded slowly, as if he were carefully choosing his next words. Then, with a steady voice, he said, "Let's talk about accessibility. I built my company in an industry where less than 2% of venture capital funding goes to black entrepreneurs. I wasn't given a seat at the table. I had to build my own." A few people in the audience clapped, but Richard wasn't ready to back down. He forced a laugh, flipping through his cue cards. "Well, there's no doubt that your company has done well, but surely you'd admit that success stories like yours are rare?" Marcus leaned forward. "They're rare because of the barriers, not the talent," he stated. "But what's truly interesting is how we never question how a wealthy white businessman got his start. No one asks if his success was a handout. Why is that?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The studio fell completely silent. The air had shifted. Marcus wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing a deep-seated bias that many tried to ignore. And at that moment, the audience knew. They were about to witness something much bigger than an interview. Richard leaned forward, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his notes. "Marcus, your journey is fascinating, but some argue that external factors played a significant role," he said with a knowing smirk. "In today's business landscape, companies prioritize diversity. Do you think that contributed to your rise more than merit?" The studio fell silent, the audience sensing the provocation. The implication was clear. Marcus hadn't truly earned his place. A few spectators shifted in their seats, recognizing the all-too-familiar narrative often used to discredit black entrepreneurs. Marcus remained poised, his confidence unshaken. He met Richard's gaze with unwavering resolve. "Are you suggesting I didn't work for my achievements?" he asked, voice steady. "Because I recall countless sleepless nights, investment rejections, and personal sacrifices. Tell me, which part of that was handed to me?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by applause. Richard chuckled, undeterred. "No one is denying your efforts," he said smoothly. "But access matters. Many entrepreneurs struggle for years, yet your company scaled rather quickly. It makes people wonder if doors were opened for you that remained shut for others." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You mean the same doors that were bolted shut for generations before me? The ones that excluded talented black entrepreneurs from funding, partnerships, and opportunities? If anything, I had to break through barriers that shouldn't have existed in the first place." The host's smirk faltered briefly before he composed himself. "That's an interesting perspective," he admitted, shifting in his seat. "But plenty of skilled individuals, many from your own community, never reach your level. Why do you think that is?" Marcus knew this tactic well, turning his achievements into an anomaly rather than evidence of progress. "Talent has never been exclusive to any one group," he responded. "The real issue is access. Many brilliant minds lack the resources to grow their ideas. My success isn't proof that the system is fair. It's proof that, despite obstacles, some of us manage to push through. But imagine if those barriers didn't exist at all. How many more would thrive?" The audience broke into applause again. Richard's attempt to frame Marcus's story as an exception was crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. Still, the host wasn't finished. He leaned back, adopting a more casual tone. "Your passion is admirable," he said. "But let's be honest, your company isn't the first of its kind. Some say you benefited from a convenient cultural moment. Investors today want to align with certain narratives. Would you agree?" Marcus smiled, sensing the direction of the conversation. Every era has businesses that capture a moment, but staying power isn't given. It's earned. Companies don't last without real value. If investors saw potential in my vision, it wasn't charity, it was business. Richard nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the desk. "So, you're saying success is purely a result of effort?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I'm saying opportunity plus preparation creates success. No one succeeds alone, but effort determines who rises and who doesn't." The host pursed his lips, sensing his strategy wasn't working. He decided to pivot. "Well, some critics claim your company operates under certain advantages. Government incentives, media favoritism, things that aren't available to others. Thoughts?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "That argument ignores reality. If incentives exist, they're there to correct historic disadvantages, not hand out unfair advantages. And media attention? That's earned. Consumers don't support brands out of pity. They support value, quality, and trust." Richard exhaled sharply, realizing he was losing control of the conversation. He had anticipated defensiveness, perhaps even an emotional outburst. Instead, Marcus was countering every claim with measured, logical responses. The audience could see it too. Deciding to take one last shot, Richard smirked. "Let's switch gears. You once said your goal is to uplift aspiring entrepreneurs. If that's true, why aren't there more like you? Shouldn't we be seeing more success stories at your level?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You just answered your own question. If the system were truly fair, we would see more. The fact that stories like mine are still rare proves that change is still happening. Too slowly, but happening nonetheless." A few heads in the audience nodded in agreement. Richard forced a smile, realizing he had underestimated his guest. The tension in the room had shifted. What started as an attempt to discredit Marcus had turned into a powerful moment of clarity. Richard finally sat back, rubbing his chin. "Well," he said, trying to regain composure. "You certainly have a way with words." Marcus smiled. "I have a way with the truth." The audience erupted in applause. Marcus leaned forward, maintaining his composed demeanor. He had seen this pattern before. Successful black entrepreneurs being questioned in ways their white counterparts never were. But he wasn't here to play defense. He was here to expose the bias. "You've brought up a lot of interesting points, Richard," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But let's talk about fairness for a moment. How often do you question white entrepreneurs about whether they deserve their success?" The host's confident smirk wavered, but he quickly masked it. "I ask tough questions to all my guests," Richard responded smoothly. Marcus nodded. "That's fair," he said. "But let's test that. Last week, you interviewed a tech CEO who inherited millions and used it to launch his company. Did you question whether he benefited from convenient timing or external advantages?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Richard hesitated. That interview had been a glowing celebration of the entrepreneur's achievements. No probing about diversity quotas, no insinuations about handouts, just admiration for his business acumen, Marcus continued, his words cutting through the growing tension. See, when a white entrepreneur succeeds, it's innovation. When someone like me does, it's a debate. A few audience members nodded. Others whispered among themselves. Richard tried to regain control. That's not what I'm saying, Marcus, he insisted. I'm simply pointing out that different factors contribute to success. Marcus smiled, knowing he had cornered him. Exactly. And one of those factors is the additional scrutiny black entrepreneurs face, the assumption that we need extra help to succeed, that we can't build something great without an asterisk next to our name. Richard exhaled sharply. He flipped through his notes, searching for a way to redirect the conversation. But Marcus wasn't finished. My company wasn't built on luck, he said, voice unwavering. It was built on long nights, relentless effort, and the ability to see opportunities where others didn't. And yet, here I am, having to justify my success as if I haven't earned it. The audience was shifting. Some who had initially nodded along with Richard's line of questioning now looked uncomfortable. They were seeing the difference in how Marcus was being treated. The bias was becoming undeniable. Richard, sensing the tide turning, forced a chuckle. I respect your journey, Marcus. Really, I do. But you have to admit, these conversations are important. Marcus didn't let him off the hook. They are, he agreed, but only if they're fair. If we're truly having an honest conversation, then let's ask the same tough questions across the board. Let's examine how many businesses fail because of systemic barriers, not just who managed to beat the odds. A woman in the audience clapped. A few others joined in. Richard stiffened but kept his composure. Look, I don't doubt your hard work, he said. But some might argue that these discussions about bias and race take away from the focus on business itself. Marcus tilted his head slightly. That's convenient, isn't it? He said. When race is used to question my achievements, it's a fair discussion. But when I bring up bias, suddenly, it's taking away from the business focus. The crowd reacted immediately, murmuring louder than before. Richard's face hardened for a brief moment, but he quickly masked it with a tight smile. Marcus pressed on. Let's be real. You didn't bring me here to celebrate my work. You brought me here to challenge whether I belong in the room. But here's the thing. Whether people like it or not, I do belong, and I won't let anyone diminish that. Another wave of applause erupted. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing the momentum was slipping from his grasp. He had underestimated Marcus, assuming he would either stumble or react emotionally. Instead, Marcus had turned the conversation on its head, revealing the host's bias in real time. The audience's energy had changed. The skepticism that had lingered at the start of the interview had faded. People weren't just listening to Marcus. They were rooting for him. Richard forced a polite laugh, clearly struggling to maintain control. Well, Marcus, he said, trying to wrap things up, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. Marcus smiled, knowing full well he had just won the exchange. That's what I came here to do. The applause was louder this time, undeniable. The moment had shifted. The conversation wasn't just about Marcus's success anymore. It was about the deeper biases that had been exposed, and everyone in that room had just witnessed it. As the tension in the studio reached its peak, a shift began unfolding in real time, one that Richard never saw coming. A researcher on Marcus's team had been quietly working behind the scenes, pulling together key moments from Richard's past interviews. And now, the receipts were about to be revealed. A producer signaled to the control room, and suddenly, the large screen behind them flickered to life. Let's take a quick look at some of your past interviews, Richard, Marcus said, his tone calm but pointed. The clip began playing, and the audience leaned forward, eager to see what was about to unfold. First, there was an interview with a renowned black scientist. Richard had questioned whether his success came from talent or if he had been pushed forward to meet diversity targets. The scientist had laughed awkwardly, brushing it off, but the discomfort had been evident. Then another clip surfaced, this time with a black female CEO who had revolutionized the beauty industry. Richard had suggested that her company thrived only because of a cultural moment, implying that her achievements were more about trends than business acumen. More clips followed, each one reinforcing the same pattern. When it came to successful black individuals, Richard's tone shifted. His questions carried undertones of doubt, his words laced with subtle dismissiveness. The contrast was glaring. The audience gasped, some whispered among themselves, others shook their heads. Richard's confident smirk had disappeared. He sat stiffly, his face draining of its usual composure. Marcus let the silence linger before speaking. "Richard, do you notice a pattern?" His voice wasn't angry, just steady, firm, and full of conviction. Richard cleared his throat. Marcus didn't let him finish. "Every single time a black person sits in that chair, you question whether they've truly earned their success. But when it's a white entrepreneur, you celebrate their achievements without hesitation. You don't ask if they got lucky. You don't suggest they were given a handout. You just assume they belong." A single clap echoed through the room. Then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was applauding, their voices rising in agreement. Richard shifted uncomfortably, attempting to salvage his reputation. "I don't think that's fair," he started, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I ask tough questions to everyone." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" He gestured toward the screen. "Because what we just saw tells a different story." The applause grew louder. Richard looked toward the producers, silently pleading for a way out. But there was no escape. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. Marcus took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. Black excellence isn't about proving ourselves over and over again to people who refuse to see our worth. It's about breaking barriers, building legacies, and lifting others as we climb. And no amount of bias, hidden or blatant, can take that away from us. The audience was on its feet now, clapping, cheering, energized by the moment. Richard sat frozen, trapped in the consequences of his own words. For years, he had gotten away with these subtle digs, these patronizing comments disguised as tough journalism. But today, under the weight of truth, his facade had finally cracked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but victorious. He hadn't just defended his success, he had exposed a much larger issue, one that everyone watching would now be forced to confront. Richard, for the first time in his career, had nothing left to say. The moment was nothing short of explosive. Within hours, clips of the interview flooded social media, spreading like wildfire across every platform: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Everywhere people were talking about what had just unfolded on live television. The hashtags number exposed, number racist host, and number Marcus wins dominated the trends. With millions of users dissecting every second of the exchange, Marcus's takedown of Richard wasn't just a victory for him. It became a rallying point for countless others who had experienced the same kind of subtle yet insidious bias. People of all backgrounds shared their thoughts, with many praising Marcus's composure, intelligence, and refusal to let the narrative be twisted against him. Some posted clips of Richard's previous interviews, comparing how differently he treated white and black entrepreneurs. Others shared their personal experiences, recalling how they, too, had been forced to prove their worth in ways their white counterparts never had to. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Major headlines read, "TV host humiliated after attempting to undermine. Black entrepreneur. Marcus Carter shuts down racist narratives on live TV," and "media bias exposed in viral interview." Late-night talk shows played segments from the interview. Comedians poked fun at Richard's awkward expression when the clips of his past interviews surfaced, and panel discussions debated the broader implications of the moment, Marcus's name was now everywhere, and not just in business circles. He had become a cultural icon. Meanwhile, Richard was facing the kind of scrutiny he had never anticipated. At first, he tried to ignore the backlash, hoping it would blow over, but as the criticism mounted, his network was forced to respond. They released a carefully worded statement, claiming that they valued diversity and inclusion and were committed to fair and unbiased journalism. However, the public wasn't satisfied. Sponsors began pulling out, advertisers distanced themselves from the show, unwilling to be associated with a host whose credibility was now in question. A petition demanding Richard's resignation quickly gained traction, amassing hundreds of thousands of signatures in a matter of days. His reputation, once untouchable, was now in freefall. Richard attempted damage control, issuing an apology on his social media accounts. He insisted that his comments had been misinterpreted and that he had never intended to offend anyone. But the internet wasn't buying it. His history spoke for itself, and no carefully crafted apology could erase the pattern of behavior that had now been exposed. While Richard struggled to salvage his career, Marcus was thriving. His business, already successful, saw a massive surge in support. Sales skyrocketed as people rallied behind him, eager to support a Black entrepreneur who had not only built an empire, but had also stood up against bias in the media. Investors reached out with new opportunities, eager to be part of his next venture. Universities invited him to speak to students about resilience and success. Influential leaders, both in business and civil rights, commended him for handling the moment with grace and intelligence. Marcus, however, knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. In the days following the interview, he used his newfound spotlight to amplify conversations about racial bias in the media, the challenges Black entrepreneurs face, and the need for systemic change. He appeared on podcasts, spoke at conferences, and engaged in discussions that pushed for better representation and fairness in business and journalism. This was no longer just a viral moment. It was a movement. Despite the negativity that had sparked it, the entire ordeal proved something powerful. Resilience, dignity, and truth would always win over hate and prejudice. Marcus hadn't just defended himself. He had shifted the conversation in a way that couldn't be ignored. And as for Richard? He had spent years questioning whether Black success was truly earned. Now, for the first time, he was the one being questioned. And this time, there was no way to spin the narrative in his favor. The interview that started as an attempt to discredit Marcus Carter had turned into a defining moment in media history. What was meant to be a subtle, condescending takedown had become a lesson in resilience, exposing the deep-seated bias that still lingered in certain spaces. But more than that, it had become a testament to the power of preparation, self-belief, and the ability to rise above negativity. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. Success is not defined by race. It is not a product of handouts, shortcuts, or lowered standards. True success is the result of hard work, perseverance, and the refusal to be boxed in by other people's expectations. Marcus had proven this not just through words but through action, by calmly dismantling every attempt to undermine him, by standing tall in the face of doubt, and by letting his achievements speak for themselves. The audience that had once been indifferent was now inspired. Many had walked into that studio with unconscious biases, shaped by years of subtle narratives that suggested Black entrepreneurs had to prove themselves in ways others didn't. But by the end of that interview, they had witnessed something undeniable. Excellence does not need validation from those who refuse to see it. Meanwhile, Richard Lawson had become a cautionary tale, a once respected journalist, now exposed for his condescending attitude toward successful Black figures. He was no longer the one controlling the conversation. His smirks, his dismissive tone, his carefully crafted questions meant to paint Marcus as a lucky exception. Everything had backfired. Now, instead of being known as a tough interviewer, he was recognized as a man whose attempts to belittle greatness had only highlighted his own biases. The consequences extended beyond social media outrage. His reputation took a severe hit, with industry professionals distancing themselves from him. Once trusted colleagues hesitated to associate with a man who had been so publicly exposed. His credibility, once seen as unshakable, was now in question. And in an industry built on trust, that was a fatal blow. Marcus, on the other hand, walked away stronger than ever. His story was no longer just about business. It was about perseverance in the face of doubt, about proving that success is earned, not given. The response to his interview solidified his place as a leader, not just in entrepreneurship, but in a broader cultural conversation about opportunity, bias, and the power of staying true to oneself. But this wasn't just about Marcus. It was about the countless others who had been dismissed, doubted, and disrespected. His story became a beacon for every entrepreneur, every professional, every person who had been told they didn't belong. It was proof that resilience wins. So, to anyone watching, reading, or listening, this is your reminder. Your success is yours to define. No matter the obstacles, the doubters, or the biases you face, your journey is built on your effort, your skills, and your refusal to let anyone else control your narrative. And to those who underestimate greatness, remember Richard Lawson. Because history doesn't remember the doubters. It remembers the ones who rise.